Every summer, thousands of holidaymakers flock here to the British seaside to enjoy the warm weather, the pebble beaches and the amusement arcades. But there's another side to these shores, a sinister underbelly of violence and murder, where sins are washed away in the tide and where the seafront is stalked by sadistic killers who, like the ocean itself, have no respect for human life. My name's Dr. Nell Darby. I've written extensively about the history of crime, researching the reasons why people kill. Over the course of my career, I've developed a keen eye for spotting trends in a killer's behaviour. Nowhere are these trends more striking than in the not-so-sunny seaside towns of Britain's coastline, which have always seemed to attract an extraordinarily high number of murderous rogues. In this series of Murder by the Sea, I examine a selection of chilling new cases, many of which have never been featured on television before. Join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea, and where life meets death. On Murder by the Sea today, we look at a rather unusual case from a Welsh seaside town, where the murder of a husband by his long-suffering wife went undiscovered for nearly 20 years. This murder took place in a seaside town, and you normally associate these seaside towns with tourists, with holidaymakers coming in and having a nice time. And what we forget is that there are other people living here all year round. The Williams were a typical family from the area. They were living their lives as best they could. And it just shows that these holidaymakers coming into towns have no idea what's going on really behind people's front doors.
Hazel Williams was 21 when she married Robert Bobby Williams. He was 24. This was in 1957, and quite quickly they had 4 children. And although relations between Hazel and the Williams family were a little strained, by all accounts, in those early years, Robert Williams was a decent husband and a loving father to those children.
They lived in a flat, in a 3-storey building known as Castle Hall Flats in Penmaen Mawr in North Wales. It is split into 3 different sections, and Hazel and Bobby actually lived, or Robert, or Bobby as he was known, they lived in the bottom flat. And below the actual kitchen floor of the flat was a cellar, which wasn't known to everybody. It was something that only Hazel and Bobby were aware of.
It can't have been easy for Hazel. Money was tight, and money was tight primarily because Robert Williams doesn't really appear to have worked very much. He spent as much time on the dole as he spent in paid employment. At some point, he has a run-in with the police. It's a motoring offence, petty offence, but he's given a fine. Robert Williams hasn't any money. He can't pay the fine. So he's taken to court, and when he can't pay the fine in court, he's sent to prison for 21 days. That experience appears to have changed Robert Williams dramatically. When he comes out of prison, he's a bitter, angry man.
His personality suddenly changed, and he began to drink more heavily, and he became when he was drinking, he became violent. And it was common practice then for him to come back from the social club in a drunken state, fueled by alcohol, and actually start an altercation, start an argument with Hazel, and eventually assault her.
When Bobby Williams was released from prison, he was outraged by unfounded rumours amongst the locals regarding the paternity of one of his children.
There were rumours that one of those children was not actually Robert Williams's child, and that may have caused, well, certainly the suspicion was that it may have caused some friction between Mr. and Mrs. Williams for some time, that this was an issue that they would always come back to.
Someone had whispered in his ear, as it were, that Gwen, his second child, was in fact not his, that Gwen had been fathered, his daughter, by another man, and she was illegitimate. And this apparently caused him some great distress, and as I say, the drinking became far heavier, and the violence increased, the arguments increased, and the marriage was clearly in a bad state of affairs.
The more he drank, the more he brooded, and the more he brooded, the more he drank. And when he came home from those drinking sessions, he was violent. He would harangue and yell at Hazel, and more than that, he would beat her with his fists. This wasn't a slap, this was a punch. These were punches he rained down on his young wife. So much so that both she and the children bore very clear signs of his violence. They were seen to have bruises, both Hazel and the children, and those bruises had been inflicted by Bobby.
Women who suffer in abusive relationships, it psychologically damages them. It causes them to suffer a considerable amount over a long period of time. It's not something that happens instantaneously, but it wears an individual down. It damages them, it causes health difficulties, it gives them difficulties as far as mental health is concerned. And of course, you're also bearing in mind that this is a lady that is suffering from abuse, is suffering physical and mental abuse, and also she's trying to bring up 4 young children as well. And the stress of all that together undoubtedly will have had a substantial effect on Hazel.
Domestic violence has always taken place, but our attitudes towards it have changed over time. So in the 60s, you can imagine that, it wasn't really much talked about. It was something kind of acknowledged tacitly as something that went on in some households, but you wouldn't get neighbours kind of spotting it and reporting it to police to the extent that we would today. There's a lot more awareness of it today and a lot less tolerance towards it. So what happened behind your own front door stayed behind your own front door. So although people might have suspected Robert of treating his wife badly, they wouldn't have reported it. And in fact, there was concern raised by neighbours that Hazel was missing a couple of front teeth. But, when they raised it with her and kind of asked whether she was going to the dentist or not, she said, no, who needs to when you've got a husband like mine? So she was acknowledging that he was violent towards her, and that's why she had injuries or missing teeth. But still, the neighbours didn't do anything about it, even though she'd told them what was going on.
One evening in April 1963, Robert Williams, Bobby Williams, went out drinking. And he drank, and he brooded, and he brooded, and he drank. And when he got home, as was his wont, he was in a rage. He was not just violent, he was in a violent rage. And he was behaving like a crazy man.
The incident became violent, and eventually he struck Hazel a blow, which struck her to the face and caused her to fall to the floor. And as she was doing so, she knocked against the pram, which was nearby, and of course the 6-month-old daughter was in the pram, and in fact knocked the child out of the pram, and the child began screaming.
And Hazel, in fear for her life, grabbed the baby and barricaded herself in the children's bedroom. And while she was in there, she could hear Bobby Williams outside rampaging throughout the flat, shouting that his children were bastards and that she, Hazel, was a whore.
He started to throw clothes onto the fire. He started ripping off the wallpaper from the walls. He started to dismantle a bed. He was in a violent rage. I think he was described as like an animal.
I think in this case, there was clearly a risk of further harm to the child. The child seemed to be in a position where there could be life-threatening injury, and that, I think, is probably the final trigger that led to the assault.
Eventually, she plucked up the courage and unlocked the bedroom and walked out into the flat.
It's not the norm for a woman to be able to fight back. They're often more in fear than they are actually in an aggressive sort of mental state. They wish they could, but they don't. But there are a fairly significant number of individuals who will, when pushed too far, actually strike back. And when a woman strikes back, there is absolutely no mercy whatsoever.
Hazel had endured years of abuse. She'd never been the fighting sort, she'd never fought back. But this night in April 1963, she snapped. And she picked up a hammer, a 3-pound hammer, and with one blow, smashed it into her husband's skull. The adrenaline must have been coursing through her veins, and that meant that the force with which she hit her husband was enough to kill him with a single blow.
I don't think it's at all clear that at that stage there was any intention of killing anybody. I can't be sure of that, but I think it is just as likely that at that stage the child is harmed. The child is put in the way of further serious harm. The mother knows where this can go because it's been happening to her for a long time. And there is the hammer, and at that stage, the only way to stop it, not stop it permanently, but to stop it, is you pick up the hammer and you hit. And I think that is certainly what may have happened.
Historically, women have tolerated quite a deal of violence from their husbands. They'll tolerate it over quite some period of time, and it's usually kind of one particular act that just drives them over the edge, where they just can't take it anymore and they explode very suddenly. Really, you could say that Hazel had plenty of opportunity to kind of lose the plot before. You know, Robert had done all sorts of things. He had accused one of their children of being illegitimate, which obviously implies a certain behaviour on her part, which, if not true, then that would send me over the edge. But with Hazel, what happened was he'd been out drinking one night, came back in and started destroying the house, and then started shoving the baby in the pram, to the extent where the baby fell out of the pram. So it's not specifically the violence to the house or the violence to the baby, it's a cumulative thing, that there is being violence on several different counts, and it builds up, and she sees all of this happening and just explodes. I don't think this act was premeditated. The fact that it was just a single blow with a hammer, which obviously was something lying around, doesn't suggest that it was a well planned out attack. But at the same time, I don't think it was a fight that got out of hand. I think it was more likely that Hazel saw Robert's behaviour and just the red mist descended, just thought, I can't take this anymore, and gave him the single blow. So it doesn't seem to me like it's an argument where you would expect kind of violence on both sides and it lasting some time. It seems more of a kind of instant, quick reaction.
So you can imagine the scenario. She's got 4 children in the house, small children, and her husband on the floor, which she's fatally struck with this hammer. You can imagine the scene, the blood, etc. She must have been absolutely terrified and in a state of extreme panic.
I think that when she realised that he was dead, she would likely have been numb to start with. There would be conflicting emotions. There would be hormonal surges going through her body. There would be accelerated heartbeat, and then that crashing, lowering stillness where her systems go down. There would be that weakness, there would be that uncertainty, and then the recognition that he has died. And I don't think it would necessarily be the recognition that I have killed him, but the recognition that he is dead. What have I done? Is this the right thing? What will happen? What will happen to my child? What will happen to me? Is it all over? Where next?
At this point, she sort of comes to. She describes it as if she was being in a sort of dream and then realising what she's done. And what she did next would eventually, 16 years later, land her in the dock, charged with killing her husband.
She only really had possibly a matter of minutes in her own mind. Perhaps the child might have woken up and she had to explain it, to suddenly make a life decision like that. So rather than admit that she had lost her temper, maybe she thought it would be inexplicable to kind of like tear apart the idea of, you know, of his violence and her response. Whatever it was, she made that decision extremely rapidly and began to cover up the whole incident.
As she sort of came to in this almost dream state and realised what she had done, Hazel decided that she had somehow to hide Bobby's body. And she grabs her husband's body and drags it across the floor and pushes it through the cellar door and down the cellar steps into the deep basement beneath their flat. And she shuts the door and locks it and tries to put what's happened out of her mind.
The decision to hide the body rather than come forward and say there was this abuse and during that I have killed him is that she probably didn't think people would necessarily believe her. I think also recognise that she would have been taken into custody of some sort for further investigation, and the child would have been taken away, put into care. There would have been other arrangements made. Given that the man, her husband, has died significantly because of the risk to the child, something she wouldn't want to do. And so there comes the business of manhandling him and putting him in the cellar out of the way, and then the business of covering up and concealing. And you've got two things then. One is once you've done it, how do you then say, I'm sorry, I've done something I shouldn't have done? You can't do that because it's not so easy to believe. He also has a family that people will say, well, that's not true. Look what you've done. And again, the question of what will happen to the child, all of this comes forward. And again, there's the numbness. There is the difficulty in accepting and understanding what I have done. And the easy way of dealing with that is pulling down the cognitive, the emotional drawbridge, and literally closing the door. And I think that's what she did.
Penmaen Mawr is a small community. Everybody knows everybody else. And everybody knows Bobby and Hazel Williams. It's not long before questions are asked. Where is he? Where's Robert Williams? At that point, Hazel decides she has to cover her tracks, and she goes to quite some lengths to do so. The first thing she does is go to her mother-in-law's, and pretending that she's worried about Robert, she says, "Is he staying here with you?" Now, she knew perfectly well where Robert was. He's in the cellar with his head caved in.
She told friends and family that Robert had gone, that Robert had left. And maybe people would have accepted that, because generally people would have known, particularly people close to Hazel would have known, that she was in an abusive relationship, that she was suffering as a result of this, and maybe it wasn't a surprise that in the end Robert left. But the longer it went on, I can imagine the far more difficult it would have been for Hazel to explain what had happened, the fact that Robert had disappeared without any trace, to explain it to her children, to explain it to close members of family, to explain it to Robert's brother and his family. That is a very, very difficult thing to do. And how she concealed what she had done and the whereabouts of Robert for such a considerable amount of time is quite difficult, but difficult to understand as well.
A few weeks after she's killed him, Hazel has realised that she needs to do more, somehow to hide the body. So she goes back down into the cellar and she wraps up her husband's body in rags and throws rubble, tons of rubble, over the top, trying to hide it. If you wanted to play amateur psychologist, you would look at this and say, this is a woman trying to hide the truth from herself as much as anybody else.
To talk of the disposal of the body is almost misleading, because in a sense she didn't really dispose of it, did she? She kept it almost with her. It was just out of the way, just out of the corner, and so she covered it, she hid it. She hoped that by denying, by hiding, it would somehow go away.
I think at the point where Hazel had dragged the body downstairs, this was kind of a stopgap. This was, you know, well, what shall I do next? But she automatically started to cover up the body. And I think that became, if you like, an end in itself, because bit by bit, she would think day on day that she was covering up more and more and he was less and less. This kind of almost ritual burial of Robert would have been, in her mind, a finality. Because the more that she placed between the outside world and him, the less likely in her mind that this piece of her past would come back to haunt her. This was something in her mind that was final.
Psychologically, you've got to wonder about why she's throwing all this rubbish down on him, and it serves two purposes. It's both to make him disappear physically as well as mentally, but it's also, you know, you've treated me like rubbish, now I'm going to treat you like rubbish. You are part of the rubbish pile. And so she's throwing this rubbish on him subconsciously because that's how she sees him. He is a piece of rubbish, he's treated her like it, and now she's getting her revenge on him. Hazel was unexpectedly strong in that she was able to continue her life after killing her husband and put up a good enough front that people weren't suspicious about what she'd done. But also, if you think about Robert's behaviour towards her over that period of time beforehand, the neighbours were probably quite happy to think that he'd left her, that he'd gone off and abandoned her, because that fit in with the kind of man he was. So there probably wouldn't have been that kind of suspicion, and there would have been a willingness to believe Hazel, because after all, this mother of four carrying on her life, how would she have been able to do that if she had killed her husband? And also, I think, because she's had this awful life with him, there's also this kind of release that he's not there anymore and she can carry on. And she later talked about the fact that the first Christmas after he'd disappeared, she was able to buy her kids toys and give them a good Christmas. You know, she's now able to give them a normal life, and she's able to have that normal life. And so that's how she can kind of carry on with the pretense.
3 years after Robert's death, after she has killed her husband, Hazel goes through what was described rightly as a macabre charade. She files for divorce on the grounds of Bobby's desertion. Now, she knew full well that he hadn't deserted her, that she had killed him and stuffed his body down in the cellar. But by that time, she's trapped in her lie. There is nothing else she can do to still the tongues in Penmaen Mawr but to file for divorce. And she filed, and she was granted her divorce.
I think the level of impact that having the body just there in the house would have affected Hazel. Here it's within her own psychology as to how well she would deal with it. Did she just compartmentalise it and cut it off from the rest of her life, not think about it, carry on as if it never happened? Or was it always there, preying on her mind and eroding her best thoughts? Was he always going to be, there in the social presence, i.e. someone mentioning him and someone saying, oh, what really happened, I've never heard from, etc. All of these things should have preyed heavily on her mind. But she seemed to cope quite well and moved her life on.
People cope with circumstances such as this in different ways. Some people simply cannot hold together under the strain, so that if she were to become ill, she'd be concerned about going to the GP, she'd be concerned about being hospitalised in case other people came in. Some people are able, it's not quite to deny it, but they're able to create an internal wall where they put that to one side and they live their life anyway, as though it hadn't happened. But there is always the shadow of it, there's always the stain of it, and it always influences, it never really goes away, it influences everything that they may or may not do.
For the next 16 years, Hazel Williams lives with the body of her husband who she has killed, literally beneath her feet in the cellar. The only separation between Hazel and her children and Bobby Williams' body is a thin plasterboard wall.
Some 16 years later, in 1979, the new landlord of the premises, Jeff Smith, who'd purchased the property in 1976, decided to carry out renovation work on the flats because of the poor condition that they were in. He decided that, of course, he'd start the renovation on the ground floor in Hazel's flat. And having examined the flat, he discussed with Hazel the kitchen, and he became aware that there was a cellar beneath the kitchen floor, much to Hazel's dismay. And of course, what he did decide and informed her that he was going to dig up the cellar, as it were, or clear the cellar out, in order that he could carry out further renovation of the foundations of the property.
Somewhere she must have known at some point something will have to be done, something will have to happen. And she will have had two sets of feelings conflicting. On the one hand, dread, when, waiting for the hammer, the axe, the footstep to fall, never knowing always having that little knot in her stomach. And on the other hand, expecting a sense of relief. At last, it's in the open. And remember that by every year that it passed, then the children were that bit older. And so the risk to them of being taken away and dealt with in other ways becomes lessened. And she gets used to it. And after a while, it's almost as though it didn't quite happen. It's a different reality. I mean, this is not a woman who covered the remains up and then fled. This is a woman who stayed. And she can't have stayed and gone down and inspected her handiwork and gloated every now and again. It's something she pushed away. It's something that she preferred not to think about, and indeed wouldn't have thought about if it hadn't been discovered by other means.
If you could imagine 3 tons of household rubbish with a decaying body over 16 years, there must have been an incredibly bad smell emanating from the cellar. How Hazel coped with that is almost beyond belief. But whilst clearing the cellar, Jeff Smith came across a bone which he identified as a human bone. And the reason for that was he was a slaughterman by trade, and so he had some knowledge of carcasses and skeletons, etc. Assisted by one of the other residents, they began again to clear more rubbish, and eventually a skull, virtually a human skull, rolled across the floor as they were dragging out household waste. And of course, immediately Jeff Smith informed the police, and they attended at the house.
Dr. Donald Waite was one of the country's leading Home Office forensic pathologists. He has never forgotten the day he was summoned to attend the macabre murder scene.
I'd gone to play golf on a Sunday morning, and when I arrived at the golf club, the professional said to me, no more golf for you today, Don. The police have called and asked me to return you to Penmaenmawr. There was black mud everywhere, covering much of it, and so I set to work. You'll never get the police to help you clear anything, and detectives always like to keep their shoes clean. It's a sort of standard joke that they always like to look immaculate and very well dressed. And so I was on my own, and so I started to obviously look for a skeleton. If there's a skull and 2 arm bones, I'm going to find a skeleton, I thought. So I started to remove all this debris, and I came across a lump hammer, I came across other instruments and other tools, and I put them all to one side and got the stuff, the milk bottles out of the way, all the clothing out of the way. I didn't think that was going to be involved. I piled all that up. All the stones and the debris and the mud. It took me hours, and eventually I came onto the bones. It was pretty well a human skeleton. It was a real jigsaw puzzle to put it all together, to fit it all together, and in terrible, terrible dirty conditions. So I got all the bones together with the various tools, collected them all together, put them in the boot of my car, and drove back to Bangor to the hospital. And I assembled a complete skeleton, apart from a few finger bones and some toe bones and 1 or 2 foot bones. I got a complete skeleton. I knew I was dealing with a male skeleton. It was a man's skeleton. And on the side of the head, there was a cavity. And I looked at the cavity, and it was rectangular. And I then went to the tools that I'd got, and I got the lump hammer and compared the lump hammer to the skull, and I'd got the murder weapon. It absolutely fitted into the hole on the side of the skull. And so I said, okay, we've got a murder victim, we've got the weapon, and of course we hadn't got any identification as to what this skeleton was. We knew he was a man and he was aged 30 to 40. They said that the man who'd gone missing was a Robert Williams, and his wife was Hazel Williams, and we managed to get a dental record back from when he was in the army. He did national service. But the dental records fitted. There was nothing out of place. So we identified him very quickly.
Within hours, the police, having been called to the scene, would have been asking questions, inevitable questions, about people who were living in the apartment block or in the building, and whether there were any mysterious disappearances, whether there was somebody who had gone off and not come back from somewhere. Obviously those questions would have been asked, and the finger of suspicion was very soon pointed at Hazel.
They arrest Hazel on suspicion of murder, and Hazel admits very quickly that she killed her husband. The police take her into custody, charge her with murder, and for the first week they keep Hazel in custody, not because she poses a threat to anybody else, but because they fear the community will attack Hazel. Robert Williams' family and friends still lived in the area, so Hazel is kept in protective custody for a week before she's finally released on bail.
One of the most fascinating things that Hazel said later, after the body had been discovered, was that she felt like she'd had a headache for years and that headache has suddenly gone. And you can imagine this kind of low level of stress and panic that's in the background all the time while she's carrying on ostensibly living this normal life, that she knows what's in that cellar. She can't tell anybody, she's got to keep it to herself. And so I can completely understand this description of having this headache. It's something worrying her in the background all the time, that she thinks that at any point she could get discovered. A lot of people will wonder how Hazel was able to carry on living in a house with her husband's body in the cellar. And not only that, the fact that all the other tenants in the building, they also lived with this unknown body in the cellar. They had no idea. And it does play into our fears, you know, from horror movies and things, of things living in the cellar or things being down there, or this darkness underneath. So the fact that it's in the cellar, which is kind of a place of fear for a lot of people, it really does play into kind of our base fears about life, death and darkness. So it's kind of like a horror movie in that sense.
She had support from her lawyer, a local solicitor. She had support from many people in the community who had been aware of the abuse that she had suffered. It wasn't hidden. It was an open story that Hazel had been through an extremely difficult time at the hands of an abusive, cruel husband. And clearly people's memories of that influenced the way they then responded towards Hazel. And there was a lot of sympathy during that time for Hazel, and a lot of understanding, not necessarily about what she did, but about why she did what she did.
By the time the case comes to court, the charge isn't murder, Hazel Williams has agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter.
She also pleaded guilty to preventing the burial of Robert's body. There was a swathe of sympathy for her, certainly within the community as well. And people gave evidence and provided statements in relation to Hazel. And it described her as a very present lady, a very happy person that would help anybody. And also their knowledge of this dreadful life that she was living with Bobby, and described seeing her with bruises, seeing her with cuts. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because it's quite sad, that the neighbours also describe injuries to the children. So not only was he beating and assaulting Hazel, but he was beating and assaulting the children. And bear in mind, the children were of tender age.
Instead of facing a life sentence for murder, Hazel Williams receives the kindest sentence the judge could impose. Manslaughter and preventing the lawful burial of a body can often bring with them lengthy prison sentences. But the judge, Mr. Justice Payne, said, no, you've suffered enough. And he told Hazel Williams explicitly, he said, what you've had to live with, the decision you made and what you've lived with for the last 16 years has brought you more pain and suffering than anything this court can impose. And he gave Hazel an absolute discharge. And that meant she walked from the court a free woman.
The fact that the court gave her an absolute discharge, meaning she could never be prosecuted for that offence ever again, was kind of a very, very, very kind of groundbreaking around this at time, because the level of mitigation would have adjusted the sentence. It wouldn't have gotten rid of the sentence entirely. This was to some degree breaking new ground in terms of domestic abuse being seen as mitigation in court.
This is such an unusual case in terms of the murderer being the wife and the victim being the husband. But it still surprises people, and surprised me, how much sympathy Hazel got from the community and how much sympathy she was dealt with in court. You know, she admitted killing him. She admitted that she'd been, provoked by him, that he'd been abusive towards her. But also I think she got sympathy because she acknowledged the toll it had taken on her mentally, the fact that she had been living with this stress and that it was actually a relief for his body to be discovered and for history to kind of catch up with her.
During the latter part of her marriage, Hazel had met a gentleman by the name of Stanley Jones. Stanley resided in Castleview Flats, just above the flat above her, and they'd become friends, and he became aware, obviously, of the distress she was going through and the violence, etc. And they had a great fondness for each other, which eventually developed into love, as it were. And he made it quite plain, and in fact gave evidence in court to the judge that his intention was to marry Hazel at the earliest opportunity. And in fact, as they left the court arm in arm, Hazel also announced that she was going to marry Stanley, which they did a short time after.
This is a case symptomatic in many ways of its time. The 1960s was still an era when domestic violence wasn't talked about. Women were beaten, as they are today, but people didn't talk about it. It was a dirty little secret that was not discussed. And women couldn't really go to the police in those days because even when the police deigned to listen to complaints about husbands beating their wives, they treated this, they viewed this, and they described this is in their own words, as, oh, that's a domestic. We don't do domestics.
This woman, having to partition her mind between what she knows has happened and attempting to live an ordinary life and bring up children in spite of it, with the reality of the death sitting below her, is something that many, many people simply could not have coped with, and they would either have fled or had to be admitted with a psychological breakdown. In that regard, I think this is a most remarkable woman.
Certainly, looking over the case and considering the facts of the case, it appears that this is an exceptional case and exceptional circumstances, and that the wheels of justice moved in the correct way and in an appropriate way as far as Hazel Williams was concerned.
This case really sticks with me because it's still unusual today, the fact that a woman puts up with so much violence from her husband before finally having enough and killing him, but then is able to live a normal life for years, knowing exactly where her husband is under the cellar, keeping it secret from absolutely everyone. And Hazel must have been such a strong woman, firstly to do what she did, but secondly to maintain that visage of kind of normality in front of everyone, including the people closest to her, which is her children. Hazel Williams lived with the secret of what she'd done for 16 years. But this case is a sobering reminder that although you can hide a body for years, justice never sleeps, and one day the police will come knocking.